Thank you for listening.
Tell you just a little bit about it before we get started. The time to get a divorce, and by videotape in about 35 or more states. And when I first delivered it, right here at this very spot, the first time, I had no idea that it was going to bring the response that it did. There was a young lady in the audience who was engaged, and she went and that night broke up her engagement. And initially I felt like I ought to apologize for that. But then on second thought, I realized that if the things that I said in the sermon led to a breaking up of an engagement, then maybe that was a relationship that needed to end. And others have done likewise since I have preached it in other places. And recently, some of the parents of this congregation went to our elders and said, please ask David to present that again. And I am delighted to comply with their request and present to you this message from God's Word. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall be joined unto his wife. And I pointed out in the sermon here this morning that word joined translates a Greek word that can be accurately translated glued to his wife, suggesting a permanency in that union. And what therefore God hath joined together, let not man tear apart. Those words remind us of how marriage is sacred and that it is designed by God to be permanent. I want to tell you about a phone call that I got. A lady called me while I was in my office here at Wood Avenue one day, and she told me her name. She said, I doubt that you know me. She said, but I feel like I know you because I've watched you on television. And she said, and I need some advice. And she began to tell me about her marriage. She revealed that she'd been married 6 years at that point. And she said, when we first got married, she said, everything was just wonderful. She said it was just such a great thing. And then I heard her voice break, and she said, but lately, things are just falling apart. She said, I'm miserable. And she said, and that's what I need the advice about. And I said, well, tell me what you're calling about. What's the situation? And she proceeded to tell me then that her husband had started drinking a lot. And she said, and Mr. Sain said, when he drinks, he just gets so mean. And almost like in defense of him, she just very quickly said, now understand that when he's not drinking, he's all right. He's just a good man. But when he's drinking, she said, he just gets so mean, and said he just talks so hatefully to me, and he's hit me a few times. And she paused, and I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. And she said, and we now have 2 little children. And she said, and they're just scared to death of their daddy when he comes home this way. And she said, as I said, he gets so mean, he curses me, and he slapped me some, and She said, oh yeah, and another thing. She said, he's not a Christian. She said, when we were dating, she said, I was already a Christian. And she said, and I did my very best to try to get him to go to church with me, but he just wouldn't go. And finally he just told me, he said, well, that his mama was prejudiced against my church or my religion, and that she wouldn't let him go with me. But he promised me that once we were married, that he would go to church with me. And she said, Mr. Sain, he never has kept that promise. He still won't go with me. And she said, what I want to know, can I divorce him and have a Bible right to marry again? And by this time she was crying almost uncontrollably. And I gave her a moment to regain her composure, and I said, well, can I ask you a question or two? And she said, of course. And I said, now you say that he's drinking a lot. And she said, yeah, more and more. He is, as longer we're married, said he just drinks more and more. I said, when did he start that? When were you aware the first time that he drank? So she paused for a second and she said, well, that was back when we were dating. She said he didn't drink much back then, but he did drink some. And I said, you say he curses you and verbally abuses you? And she said, oh, yes. And I could just tell by the tone of that voice that verbal abuse was as painful to her as maybe physical abuse. And I said, when did that first take place in your relationship? And she thought for a second and she said, well, I guess that started when we were dating too. She said, because he used to just get so mad at me and talk so hatefully to me. I said, you said he slapped you some. She said, yeah. I said, when was the first time he slapped you? She said, well, and her voice got awfully soft and meek-like, and she said, well, that was when we were dating too. She said, he thought I had lied to him, and I hadn't, but he thought I had, and he slapped me. And I said, and you say he won't go to church with you? She said, no, he won't go to church with me. And he never did while you were dating? No. I said, in other words, everything that you've said to me about this husband of yours that makes you so miserable and makes you want to know, can you divorce him? The drinking, the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, not going to church, all of those things that are making you so miserable, he was doing before you married. She said, yeah, that's true. Well, I didn't want to add to her pain. It was obvious the lady was in a miserable emotional state. And so I didn't open up and say to her everything that was on my mind, but in my mind, here's what I was saying to me. She's now miserable for all of the reasons that he was doing to her and guilty of before they married. Now she's wanting to know, can she divorce him? The time she should have divorced him was when they were married, when they were dating, before they married. the time to get a divorce is before you marry. Now, I'll come back to that. I then turned to her and I said, well, you asked me, can you divorce him? I said, to your knowledge, has he been sexually unfaithful to you? And she said, no, I don't think so. And I said, well, then let's study together what the Bible teaches about the matter. And so I began to go through the scriptures of what the Bible teaches about it. And when I got through, she said, well, I don't guess I do have the right to remarry, so I can't divorce him. And she thanked me for my time and she hung up. And when she hung up, I just reached and pushed against my desk and pushed my chair back a little bit, and I just sat there and thought for a little while about that conversation. And I just kept hearing those words ringing in my head. The time to get a divorce is before you marry. And right then, I determined that I was going to put together a sermon that I hope will help some of these young people here tonight avoid the misery that that young lady found herself in. I don't think there's a one of you that are sitting there thinking right now, ooh, I want to be like her. I want to end up that way. No, you don't think that. And I want to do what I can to help you to avoid it. Of course, see, I realize that we're very idealistic about these kind of things, and we think, well, boy, that's sad, but I'm not going to end up that way. My marriage is going to be different. Let me tell you something. Right about here was where I was standing a number of years ago when a young lady and her groom-to-be and the families of both of them were all gathered here for a wedding rehearsal. And so I'm standing here, we're watching all the things take place that have to be done for a wedding rehearsal, and she walked over from over there and she walked right up beside me, and he was sitting along about over here on the third or fourth row, and she just pointed at him. She said, isn't he gorgeous? I said, well, not to me. I mean, no. She said, oh, I just think he's drop dead gorgeous. And I said, well, I'm glad you think so, but he's not to me. And she said, and she just kind of got up a little closer and she said, you know, we're going to have the perfect marriage. I didn't have the heart to tell her differently. I just thought, well, let her go ahead and think this, you know, and there's no such thing. You know, you just don't have a perfect marriage. You just don't have them to happen that way. Some of them end up really happy, not perfect, but they're happy. And they're good marriages. And others fall apart. And other people end up miserable like that young lady that called me. I want to suggest some things to you tonight that you can do to keep from ending up like that young lady. There are two things, really. And to be sensible about the time, I can only deal with one of them tonight. The first thing is, you make sure that when you get married, you are the right kind of person. And secondly, you make sure you marry the right kind of person. That's the two best things you can do. And tonight, we're going to focus on marrying the right kind, which means picking the right kind. And to do that, I'm going to focus your attention on three words, just three words. Here's the first one. Christian. You marry a Christian. Now, hold on a second. I am not here to tell you that if you marry someone who is not a Christian, that that's a sin. I do not believe the Bible teaches that. I do believe that if a Christian marries a non-Christian, you're doing something that is of great risk. and you are putting your marriage under a heavy load from the get-go. Now, you can go in this audience, and I'm spotting some over as I look out over the audience right now, who will tell you, I was a Christian, I married a non-Christian, and we have a good marriage. And most of them will be able to tell you, my husband is now a Christian, or my wife is now a Christian. And my husband or wife might not be a Christian had we not married. I will not for a second dispute the reality of that. In fact, I rejoice with those people that that is the case. But people, listen to me. For every one of those cases that you bring to my attention, I'm going to show you a dozen that didn't turn out like that. And you also need to know that there are some of those who were not Christians when they married, who now are Christians, who will come to me with their Christian mates and say, don't you ever stop telling young people how important it is to marry someone who is a Christian. How do you do that? Does that sound like a silly question? How do you marry a Christian? Well, here's an answer you may not be thinking of. Don't date anybody that's not a Christian. Have you noticed that in our culture, we don't marry people we don't date? You have noticed that. I mean, you don't go downtown Florence, Court Street, or out to the mall and say, hey, you, come here. You know, that's not the way you pick her out or pick him out. You don't do that. Look here at my hand for just a second. Let my thumb and fingers standing up just represent, we'll say, people. And from the people that you date, because of our culture being what it is, from the people you date will come the one you marry. Right? Which means you may have already dated the one you'll marry. I said that one time. One girl said, oh boy, I'm in trouble. So, but that's reality. That if you're going to marry from that group that you date, if you date only Christians, guess what you'll marry? A Christian. But if you date some that are Christians, some that are not Christians, you may or you may not. And if you date only those who are not Christians, guess who you're going to marry? A lot of you, I know you're in school and so on, and so you may not get to watch much daytime TV, except maybe in the summertime a little bit. But there's a daytime talk show on now with Donnie and Marie and Donnie Marie Osmond. The Osmond family back years ago, some of you old enough to remember when they were really big as a singing family, but Donnie and his sister Marie have a daytime talk show. You don't have to know about all the career and all the TV shows for you to know what I want to tell you. Donnie Osmond is a Mormon. I saw him interviewed one time years ago before he married. He's married now. He was interviewed by Barbara Walters. And if you've ever seen Barbara Walters do one of her interviews, you know how persistent she can be trying to get information out of somebody. And she was picking at Donnie before he was married. You're a Mormon. The Mormons insist that you marry only a Mormon. Donnie, what would happen if you married somebody that's not a Mormon? He said, well, it won't happen. She said, no, Donnie, I mean, if you were to marry somebody that's not a Mormon, what would happen? He said, it won't happen. Donnie, you're not listening to me. I'm asking if you were to marry somebody that's not a Mormon. He said, Miss Walters, it won't happen. She said, how can you be so sure? He said, I won't date anybody that's not a Mormon. Should a Christian not have that same approach? And just says, I'm not dating anybody that's not a Christian. And if I date only Christians, then I'm going to marry a Christian. One guy came up to me one time after I did this message, and he said, well, I want to tell you one thing. If I'm not dating anybody but Christians, if you're going to cut down on my dates, I'm going to be at home a lot on Saturday night. Because I don't know that many good Christian girls. Are you ready for my reply? I looked at him and I said, I can tell you something that's worse than being alone on Saturday night, and that's being at home with the wrong kind of wife. And let me tell you something else. Marrying a non-Christian can be spiritually fatal. Here's how. Here's what I mean. Suppose I were to tell you, I want you to come and follow me out this door. Now there's a door over there, but I want you to come out this door with me. Now before you start out the door, I do want to tell you something. We've been keeping a running tab on this, and 5 out of every 10 people that go out that door do not get bitten by a rattlesnake. 5 of them do, 5 of them don't, and they die, the ones that do. They get bitten by a rattlesnake, 5 out of every 10. Now on the other side of that door is $5,000. You say, hey, that's cool, I could use $5,000. Well, come with me then. We'll just go out the door. Now, you do understand 5 out of 10 of the people who go out here to go out and get that money are going to get bitten by a rattlesnake and die. You say, wait a minute, what about this door over here? No, that's not true over there. It's just true of this door. Now, which door are you going out? You know, like, duh. That's a no-brainer. You know, I'm not going out there. Here's my point. If we can understand that with a make-believe situation, I mean, you know that's not even real. But you understand my point, that if I were to give you those statistics for real, you'd say, no way, I'm not going out that door. If we can understand that in a make-believe situation, then why can we not understand the following? That 5 out of every 10 Christians who marry non-Christians end up leaving the church and losing their souls. Yeah, some of them convert their mates. Some of them don't convert their mates and they still have a good marriage. But 5 out of 10 of them will leave the church, forsake God, and lose their souls. Now, why would you then risk your soul by marrying a non-Christian? Date only Christians, and then you'll marry a Christian, and then you'll have somebody that can help you go to heaven. Second word, morals. Take a good long look at the morals of the people you date. And then you've got a pretty good idea whether or not this is a smart thing you're doing. Some time ago, I was leading a group of young adults or teenagers in a group discussion about things like this. And I handed all of them a little 3x5 index card, and they all had a pencil. And I said, I want you to write on that card a description of the type of person that you want to marry. Well, they all wrote down on the card their answers, and when we started reading them out loud, there were the kind of things that I expected to see: good personality, and a Christian, and one that respects me, and one that loves me, and the guys, of course, would all say, well, it won't hurt if she has a good body too, you know. And so we have all those usual typical answers. And I was reading over those, and I said, wait a minute, there's something missing here. And they said, what? I said, well, none of you said, oh, and I want him to drink and smoke and cuss and lie to me. He might even slap me around a little bit too. One of the girls said, oh, Mr. Sain, because she knew I was teasing. So I said, well, okay, let's get serious about it. Why didn't you put that down? Well, because that's not what I want to marry. I've never heard any young lady say, oh, here's my dream guy. He's sprawled out on the couch. He's full of beer and he's belching real loud and he'll cuss me and lie to me. You don't hear him say things like that. And you guys say, yeah, I want somebody that'll lie to me. I can't trust her out of my sight. I want to make sure that she can really hold her beer and smoke cigarettes and all the. You don't hear that. Why isn't that in our list of ideals? Because we don't want that kind of thing. Are you listening? If you don't want to be married to that kind, then tell me, please, why you will date that kind. Why? Cool to date, terrible to marry. Remember this? If you won't date a guy that drinks, you won't marry a guy that drinks. If you won't date somebody that lies to you, then you won't marry somebody that lies to you. That boy slaps you one time, tell him, hit the road, bud. You're not in my life. You're not worthy of me. Come around here stinking like a cigarette, smelling like a can of beer, lie to me, curse me, verbally abuse me, treat me like a piece of dirt. You're not worthy of my company. Because I happen to think more of myself than that. And I'm worth more than that. I'll have no part of it. And if you just stand your ground like that, then you have greatly increased your chances of having a good life and a good dating time and then a good marriage, and you won't be calling somebody like David Sain one day crying, saying, I'm miserable. If you date, and I'm going to say it one more time in the negative side, girls, if you date only guys that drink and cuss and smoke and lie to you and that'll slap you around, guess who you're going to end up married to? And you guys, you just flip that coin over and see the picture for yourself. Back to the Christian. Be selective. And you date that kind of person that'll help you go to heaven. That'll help you have a good life. Third word, commitment. Having that sense of commitment. Now, listen carefully, because this one is a two-way street, and you can't control but one way of the two-way street. As you get into dating and you find yourself getting a little serious about somebody, you better do your best to see if that person shares the sense of commitment that you have toward marriage. See, we all need that sense of commitment, and most of you here at Wood Avenue have heard me tell about this, but it bears repeating, of a grandmother and a granddaddy that were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and their teenage granddaughter had come around, and there she was, and she sidled up to her grandmother and she said, Grandma, said, you've been married to Grandpa 50 years? Yeah. And with this granddaughter's modern way of thinking, she just couldn't resist. She said, have you ever thought about divorcing him? And Grandma didn't think very long. She said, divorce? Why, mercy, no. Now, I thought about killing him several times. But see what that mindset is? That mindset says, yeah, well, we've had some arguments and we've had some disagreements and I've been so mad at him, I thought about killing him. But divorce never even entered the picture. See, that's commitment. That's the commitment we're talking about. That when you get married, you come into it with that sense, we're going to make this work. Now, you can't guarantee that your partner has that commitment or will always have that commitment, but you need to do your best to make sure that you share that sense of commitment. And the way you do it is you don't get married overnight. You take some time to get to know each other, and when you date very long, you're going to have a few little spats and quarrels, aren't you? And you're going to see how you handle those. And do you work them out? And is this relationship worth working through those problems? I was presenting this sermon down south of here is all I'll say. That just leaves a lot of territory. None of you know the guy anyway, I don't guess. But I did this sermon one night, and after I was through, this young man came up to me and had a young lady beside him, and he introduced her as being his new wife. And he said, well, we've been married about a year now. But he said, you were talking about that sense of commitment tonight. He said, boy, I said, I couldn't help but think about the pep talk that her daddy gave us. He said, right before we were getting married, he said, I was over at her house one night and said, her daddy walked in and said he was a great big guy, tall, big old broad shoulders, had a big old deep gruff voice. And he said, there I was sitting beside his daughter, and said he walked right over and he just got right in my face. He said, boy, you're going to take my daughter away from me. I'm going to tell you, boy, if I ever hear of you laying a hand on her, if I ever hear the word divorce even come out of your mouth, boy, you're going to deal with me. You got that? He said, I looked up and said, yes, sir. Said, then he turned to his daughter and he said, now, honey, if you're going to marry this ugly thing, I'm going to tell you, he ain't perfect. Y'all going to have some problems. Honey, I'm going to tell you, when you have those problems, don't come running home to mom and daddy. You work them out. You got that? She said, yes, sir. This boy looked up at me. He said, man, but this time I was afraid to marry her, and I was afraid not to marry her. He said I didn't know what to do. So he said, he put the fear in me. And he said, and I just thought, boy, you know, if more of us got that kind of pep talk, he said, maybe we'd bring a little bit of different commitment into this marriage relationship. That just says, boy, it's serious because it's for life. It's not like a sentence in prison now, you know, like, well, I'm stuck with her for life, you know. It's not that. It's a wonderful thing. It's a blessing. It's a marvelous situation that you enter into. And when you enter it with the right kind of person, oh, the joy is just indescribable. It's wonderful. But if you end up married to the wrong kind of person, I can't describe to you how miserable you'll be. And you just remember, there is something worse than being alone on Saturday night, and that's being married to the wrong kind of person. You be careful. You choose a Christian. Choose one with the kind of morals that you want to live with for life. And you bring that sense of commitment and make sure that partner has the same sense of commitment. And you have greatly improved your chances of having that good relationship that'll serve you well all your life. The time to get a divorce is before you marry. Now, to you girls, you boys, you young men and young women, you older men and women who are not married, I am not going to hesitate 1 second to tell you that if thinking about all this tonight has made you aware that you're in a bad relationship, a relationship that you don't need to be in, I'm not going to hesitate to tell you you have the courage to break that marriage, that relationship rather, up now before you're married. Call it off. You might be saving your soul. And I know you can be saving yourself some heartache. The time to get a divorce is before you marry. Open your songbooks, please, to the number that has been announced.
Speech on. Audio 62%. Audio. Sally. Do not disturb. 1036.
Live captions button.
62%. Add controls. Selected. Screen.